Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Lynn Weil, Director of External Affairs for CSET, the Center for Security and Emerging Technology at Georgetown University. Today, we'll discuss the amplifying effects of artificial intelligence and how they may affect disinformation campaigns, offering new capabilities that can increase their speed, volume, and reach, and tailoring messaging to target audiences more precisely. But first, a brief bit of housekeeping. All attendees' microphones are muted. If you're on a computer and experience any technical issues, use the chat function at the bottom of the screen, and a CSET team member will try to help you out. Please don't use the chat for anything else just yet. And now it's time to turn the mic over to our moderator. John Bansemer is the director of the CSET CyberAI Project and a senior fellow here. He's also an adjunct professor at Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service. And before joining CSET, John served in a variety of intelligence, cyber, and space positions with the US Air Force before retiring as a lieutenant general. His last role was serving as the Assistant Director for National Intelligence Partner Engagement within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. He also held a variety of staff positions, including on the Air Staff and the National Security Council staff. And he served as the Director of Intelligence at the European Command. John, over to you.
Thanks so much, Lynn, and thanks for the opportunity to discuss such an important and timely topic today. As we have seen, disinformation can have far-reaching impacts, and it has become an important asymmetric tool for some nation states as they seek to undermine democratic societies and institutions. And so we're very fortunate to have Katarina Sedova join us today to help explore this topic more deeply and to better understand not only its potential impacts, but also how machine learning techniques could make an already difficult problem even more challenging. Katarina Sedova is a research fellow on the CyberAI Project at CSET. Prior to joining us, she advised on cybersecurity and technology policy issues and drafted key legislation as a Tech Congress Fellow with the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee in the United States Senate. Previously, she published research and advised projects on influence operations for the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence, the Department of State, and the Department of Defense. She started her career as an engineer at Microsoft, where she worked on the internet browsing platform. She holds a BA in political science from California State University and an MS in foreign service from Georgetown University, where she focused on strategic competition in cyber and the information domains. Katerina, the floor is yours.
Thanks, John, and thank you everyone for joining us today for this very timely conversation. Okay, before we dive in, I want to take a moment to share that this research was in large part inspired by many years of watching Russia's information warfare in Ukraine, which is on powerful display as we speak. I was born and raised in Ukraine, and I know how resilient Ukrainians are and how fiercely dedicated they are to building democracy. And this moment that we're in is a stark reminder of how in Ukraine and all over the world today and every day, there are people on the front line of defending the democratic principles that we all hold dear. And combating disinformation is a key part of that effort. So with that in mind, I'll now turn to the subject of today's webinar. Last year, Jake Sullivan, President Biden's national security advisor, warned of the challenges of disinformation from the technologies that we once thought would inevitably favor democratic values. He said that if democracies don't turn back this tide, the next phase of the digital revolution will grow darker with the proliferation of autonomous disinformation. So in our research, we wanted to ask, how will AI impact disinformation operations? And in December, we launched a series of reports that unpack this question. Our bottom line is this: Advances in AI are posed to increase the scale and volume of disinformation campaigns. They will get worse before they get better, and the United States and our allies will likely face these tactics abroad and at home. When you think of AI and disinformation, deepfakes is the first thing that comes to mind. But in this project, we wanted to zoom out. We wanted to put ourselves in the shoes of the adversary and more systemically look at how threat actors might leverage AI at every step of their operations. So to help make sense of this complex environment with intertwining actors and tactics, we first built a framework, which we call rich data. Think of it as the kill chain for disinformation campaigns. Much like the cyber kill chain, it identifies the common stages that disinformation operators go through and common techniques they may use. For example, through reconnaissance, threat actors might surveil the environment to identify societal fissures, which helps inform their narratives and segment their audience. They build infrastructure such as authentic social media personas and groups or websites, or they may procure ready-made accounts from firms specializing in influence as a service. They may develop content in a variety of formats, from short posts and articles to memes, videos, or even forgeries, all to plant the seeds of the campaign messaging and to watch them grow. Once deployed, they may take to social media to amplify these messages with automated scripts or bots, or they may target the super spreaders such as media influencers or public figures in order to get them to reshare disinformation content to their large followings. At the same time, they may go hands-on keyboard with human trolls patrolling comment sections of posts, manufacturing illusion of consensus, or stirring up controversy that antagonizes readers, pulls them into an endless cycle of back and forth arguments, and encourages them to engage even further or disconnect entirely. In the final stage that we call actualization, we look at how operators may engage directly to cultivate and to turn unwitting targets into witting operators, even mobilize them to action with real-world consequences. Our findings show that AI-enabled technologies are already able to enhance many of these techniques, while others are on the horizon. For example, AI can enhance reconnaissance efforts because the data-rich environment and our many digital footprints can be harnessed by AI systems to identify sentiment in how individuals talk online, to find fissures, and to precisely target individuals. Techniques such as sentiment analysis and stance detection can help analyze text and video and offer and infer positive, negative, or neutral sentiment and emotion, and even analyze granular stances on issues. This can help identify societal grievances and target fissures that operators can widen. AI-enabled network analysis tools can help can help find clusters of accounts that are related or posting about similar narratives and help determine the strength of their relationship. These techniques can help segment which audience may be susceptible to which messages. GAN technology that you may know as deepfakes can help automate building out many aspects of the digital army, including realistic human-like avatars that are difficult for the human eye to decipher. You can see examples of some of the experiments that are readily available on the site that is a demo site for one of the AI systems. This X does not exist. From that site alone, an operator can grab an avatar of a person that doesn't exist, post pictures of a cat that doesn't exist, or stories of fabulous vacations on beaches that also do not exist. Avatars generated from the site have become a frequent feature of disinformation campaigns ever since late 2019. And threat actors interested in targeting a particular audience can fine-tune the same AI system on a smaller set of images of specific demographic groups, such as the elderly or veterans or people of color, and build a custom-made digital army for a campaign targeting a particular group. The same technology is already capable of producing videos that empower digital impersonation, are engaging, and can go viral quickly if they aren't detected and throttled in near real time. This is particularly potent in a scenario of a hack and leak operation where a realistic forgery is set into a misleading context of presumed truth, gets amplified by super spreaders and fanned into the broadcast media, reaching even a wider audience. GAN-generated audio of a cell phone quality as part of such a campaign would be difficult for a human to discern as fake. In addition, generative language models or large language models can help create a pipeline of short posts, long posts, memes, even images of objects that from only a text description in multiple languages. This further removes the cultural and language barriers. If you attended our September webinar, you may remember our discussion about large language models and GPT-3, a writing system with impressive capabilities that we amongst ourselves call an autocomplete on steroids. Last year, a few of us at CSET had a chance to test GPT-3 on its ability to create disinformation content. We used some of the same techniques that we've seen Russian Internet Research Agency actors deploy, and to varying degrees, it did well at a lot of them. It rewrote articles for the slant. It generated tweets on a theme of climate change denial. It wrote posts in a style of QAnon conspiracy theory. It even successfully persuaded a third of our survey respondents to change their position and oppose sanctions on China. Just on the horizon, the same technologies paired with human operators may soon be able to enable social media bots to mimic human behavior online. For example, a system like GPT-3 can already be integrated into a social media bot to make it more dynamic with varied messaging and more human-like with a deepfake avatar. Similar technologies with some human curation may soon enable chatbots that control human targets with precisely tailored messages. Rapid advances in conversational AI, for example, such as open domain chatbots, may take automated trolling to a whole new level with systems capable of continuous dialogue and human-like conversation on any subject. All of the above may soon plausibly combine to help threat actors in actualizing their campaigns at scale. Systems that are tuned to user sentiments and political stances and donning a deepfake clone of a trusted figure could soon engage humans directly in real-time, one-on-one conversations to radicalize them into action. Some of these scenarios may seem like a dystopian science fiction today, but the building blocks are already coming together. You can see how these capabilities could dramatically increase the volume of disinformation, in part because they help automate the labor-intensive parts of the operation. For example, a large language model like GPT-3 works as part of a human-machine team. An operator gives it a prompt with a sample of writing, and it produces a lot of posts in a short amount of time that mimic this style of writing. While it's not perfect, it can significantly reduce the cognitive load on the operator and leave them time to experiment with messages much faster and find the ones that resonate instead of creating content from scratch. It also removes the language barriers, allows the operators to do more with fewer humans, which in turn helps with operational security. In addition, these capabilities are diffusing internationally. Since the release of GPT-3 in 2020, other systems, some of them much more complex and larger, have been released by private sector actors in many nations, including China and Russia. The barriers to access are also getting lower, particularly since some of these systems are available publicly for free or for a nominal fee. Part of the problem is that detecting this content is still challenging. Deepfakes are in a race between technology that generates them and one that detects them, as they continue to leapfrog each other. And AI-generated text looks like any text on the internet. And these new challenges may exacerbate existing trends, such as increasingly cross-platform nature of disinformation campaigns that hatch on small platforms or on fringe forums where they are not policed, and then jump into the mainstream, or the blurring lines between foreign and domestic disinformation, and the unresolved tensions over distinguishing harmful disinformation and protected speech. Our select recommendations underscore that disinformation campaigns are a network problem and it requires a network solution. So it is critical that we have an early warning system and collective defense approach that help bring together signals from allies and partners, particularly those that are on the front lines of adversary experimentation. And that also means working closely with private sector platforms, big and small, because they have the best visibility into their platforms, and they can help create means to see how campaigns develop across the information environment. We also need to invest in technical means to detect AI-generated content and in provenance standards so that browsers and social media platforms can identify authorship, manipulation, and flag or neutralize this content before large numbers of users see it. This is why it's critical that threat modeling and red teaming approaches, it's critical to integrate the threat modeling and red teaming approaches in order to identify scenarios that adversaries may exploit, be it in new social media platforms or in AI research, and allow us an opportunity to build norms and mitigations before they are released publicly. But we also can't code our way out of this problem. The ultimate line of defense is a discerning human at the end of the message. We need to build resilience through awareness and education tools that can help the likely targeted groups and really all of us to discern how AI-enabled techniques can manipulate our perception of reality online. In closing, AI is going to change the nature of disinformation campaigns, and they will get worse before our defenses adjust. This has significant implications for the United States and our allies. These tactics will test foundational principles of democratic societies and could further erode trust in institutions and in information that are vital for democracies to function. So we must prepare. Finally, while I'm here, the one presenting to you today, I want to thank my co-authors and former student research analysts on this project, Christine McNeil, Aurora Johnson, Aditi Yoshi, and Ido Volkan. I know John and all of you have a lot of questions, so I will stop there and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Katja. That was a thought-provoking presentation, and there are bound to be a lot of questions and comments. John gets to exercise the moderator's privilege and kick off the Q&A himself. In the meantime, if anyone would like to ask a question, please type it in the chat and it will be read aloud. We may not get to all the questions, but we'll do our best to cover as much ground as possible. Those who are joining us by phone for this meeting, sorry, you won't be able to ask questions, and we thank you for understanding the technical limitations here.
Thanks, Lynn, and thanks again, Katya, for a great rundown of the framework and some of your findings and recommendations. I do want to just kind of start this conversation, but I already kind of see the questions coming in, so that's wonderful. But I want to go back to kind of your initial part where you kind of laid out the rich data framework and those types of pieces. The rich data framework in a lot of ways, and you even kind of alluded to this a lot, right? It does kind of allude to kind of the cyber kill chain that was introduced by Lockheed Martin. MITRE's attack framework also comes to my mind as well. My question is, how generalizable do you see this framework to the variety of possible disinformation operators? I know that you looked at Russia specifically, but I'm curious as to how well you think this is going to kind of be generalizable to a broader array of threat actors. Would it still apply in that sense?
I think it does. Yes, there is a lot of information on Russia because Russia is sort of the best in class in this space. And we also know a lot about their operations because of them targeting the US elections. However, there are other actors that may not necessarily go through the same, demonstratively the same paths, but they do deploy the same techniques. For example, we have seen amplification techniques and the use of bots and the use of spammy accounts from China related actors, both directed against the Hong Kong pro-democracy demonstrations and recently during the COVID related disinformation. We have seen tactics like establishing fake think tanks from Iranian actors or establishing websites that then end up being an anchor for a campaign and are essentially getting amplified across the spectrum of the information environment, and in fact, even social engineer media, traditional media, broadcast media, into being invited as expert panelists for commentary. So while yes, we know a lot more about Russian operations, a lot of these techniques are transferable. And as you mentioned, not all the stages are necessary, but some have to happen. Reconnaissance have to happen so that threat actors understand the environment in which they're operating and which are the hot button issues they can exploit. They need messengers. They need some accounts, either inauthentic accounts or authentic messengers that they can acquire and use. They need content. Those preparatory stages are almost often involved in some way or another. Whether they deploy just the computational propaganda and bots, or they choose trolling, or whether they even go as far as actually mobilizing people into action, those things vary, but there are some must-have steps that we tend to see across many different actors.
Thanks so much. I'd love to ask you several more questions, but they are now pouring in. So I want to turn to our audience and make sure that we hit some of those questions that are being asked in the chat, et cetera. The first question is from Robert, and he says, can you comment on how well the multi-language large language models handle cultural differences and context? And I would just add to that, as you think of both multi-language large language models, but even ones that are specific in other languages, how well are how capable are they at handling these cultural differences in context, in your opinion? Thanks.
Well, I've had direct experience with only one such model, so I can speak to GPT-3's capabilities. It was trained on internet tags that contained, if I'm not mistaken, something upwards of 70 different languages, but about 90% of its data was in English. So it understands other languages. It can produce context in other languages, content, I apologize. But it is primarily English. That said, other researchers from Middlebury Institute had tested even GPT-3 for its ability, for example, to write text in Russian, and it was able to accomplish that. That said, other nations, especially those that have declared dominance in AI as a national goal, have jumped into this race. So, for example, China now has 3 or so different models that have been released that are capable of both English, but also Chinese. So nations have taken it upon themselves to train their own national language capable model. Russian model, RuGPT, is also fine-tuned and trained on a lot more Russian text. So it's capable of having support for both languages. So I think I'll stop there, but there are multiple models out there that have capability for both English and a variety of other languages, perhaps more so than even GPT-3.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see how this plays out, right? I mean, GPT-3, I think, was the kind of the first player in this here, but as the other countries roll out their capabilities, we'll learn a lot more as we go on, for sure. I want to move on to a related question, and the question is from William Holstein: has the technology evolved? And this is more kind of in a deepfake kind of technology, particularly. Has that technology evolved to the point where bad actors can produce, for example, a fake video segment that has the emotional power? And the example that he used was the George Floyd video. So has it gotten to the point where you can create kind of a narrative with really stark emotional power in your view?
It's an interesting question. The short answer is I don't know. The slightly longer answer is I don't think so. Precisely because, as you probably have seen from some of the public demos and that are intending to kind of advance the technology, is that you still need actors to be able to do the movement themselves. So we're not at CGI level quality of deep fakes. It would require actual human actors to be able to act out the movement, especially in the context of a larger situation. So I think I'll stop there.
Fair enough. And if we have time, I'll come back to William's other question, but I want to again give time to a lot of the questions that we're seeing. And so Jeff Smith asked this question: currently, what safeguards or restrictions do the social media platforms, particularly the major ones, of course, have in place for all of the types of activities that you've just described?
Well, some of the major social media platforms have stated very quickly after the 2019 use of deepfakes was discovered, they very quickly banned the use of synthetic media for malicious purposes as a policy. Now, how they are doing in terms of detecting that content in order to take it down, that is a different question. I know there's a lot of research that some of the bigger companies are pursuing in that space to try to be able to detect and at least have a means to make a decision about this content. But there's also the policy decision on this is also complicated, because not every synthetic media is created for malicious purposes. Some of them are created for demo purposes. A lot of the research that is driving deepfakes, in fact, is for virtual environments. And, as you've frequently heard, the metaverse, where we're potentially moving towards in the information environment. So there's a positive use case for this technology, and just sort of blanket banning it may or may not be solution. This is where we're also going to have to grapple with the nuance in the mitigations as deepfakes become more common. There is something to be said for deepfake impersonation, and that I think some of the major platforms have banned. I'll be honest, I don't know what the policies are on some of the smaller platforms that have traditionally and sort of declaratively have chosen not really to police their platforms, or that don't have the resources of the big platforms to do so. So I think the mitigations there are a lot more complicated.
Just a real quick follow-up to that. When you talk about kind of the resources available, would you kind of characterize this as still predominantly a human endeavor in terms of the detection and the safeguards, or are there kind of automated capabilities that are starting to pop up that are helping these companies sort through this and, again, provide a safer environment for all of us?
Well, machine learning is sort of a general purpose and dual use, choose your term technology. So because of how machine learning works, it is capable of deciphering patterns and potentially doing a lot more detection. So in terms of resources, some of the major platforms are investing in using AI in order to detect this content. Now, text is a whole other ball game, because the kind of work that Drew Loan and Micah Mosser and Ben Buchanan and I did testing GPT-3 has convinced us that we're going to have to work a lot harder to try and mitigate these accounts and a coordination among these accounts, even more so than the platforms are already doing, because detection is really, really challenging. And so that's why I've not given up on our ability to detect synthetically generated text. And I hope this is one of the areas where the investment will go next, to find a breakthrough how to detect that media type.
Yeah, but it's going to be obviously very, very tough. We have some tough work ahead of us for a while at least. Mira asked as kind of a different question in terms of, so we just talked about the technical side of this, but how do we suggest how to use specifically, not me. Thankfully, you've done all the research here. How do you suggest the public increase the awareness of detecting deepfakes? So how would this public awareness aspect of it actually occur in your view?
That's a great question and a difficult one, because I think a lot of our media awareness and digital literacy efforts have gone to K through 12. So trying to educate the population that is actively in some medium of educational structure. We haven't figured out well how to reach wider population. And this, by the way, yes, we focus on the AI aspects of it, but this can be incorporated into just a broader digital and media literacy education in general, how disinformation campaigns work. And this is just a type of a disinformation campaign that takes advantage of the emerging technology. And I think there are nations in the world that have tried to go at it and try to really invest in educating their whole populations. Finland is one such nation. In general, the Baltic nations, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania have invested a lot in such efforts. And so we have a lot to learn from them. Now, granted, their populations are a lot smaller and maybe a bit more cohesive in terms of, political divisions than we are, but we still should try. So a way, what we really need to think through is what are the touch points that most public has? And social media companies are actually one such touch point. So why not use social media companies in a way to do a public awareness, public service campaign to be able to reach exactly the population that may be exposed to this kind of content? That's one idea I have, but I'm not in charge of social media company.
Well, you can imagine that there's a lot of questions about, well, you've highlighted all the problems, but how do we stop this, right? And so the next question kind of gets back to this deep fake problem. And Stephen asked the question, it seems to him at least that deep fakes deployed will need some type of forensics process. So either a forensic process, or I'll put a few words in your mouth, the provenance piece that you discussed earlier. So I agree with his kind of central thesis here, which is just having a lot of smart people won't be enough, or enough kind of content moderators. So what are your thoughts on kind of forensics / provenance? Can you give us a few more details on kind of things that you're seeing out there that might be promising in this regard, even if they haven't been fully deployed?
Yeah, one of the promising efforts coming out of sort of the industry and media collaboration right now is this effort to develop a provenance standard for digital media. And it comes from the idea that if people are creating synthetic media or deep fakes, if they're creating it for a positive purpose, to demonstrate as an art form of something they're developing, they're doing, then the idea is that they will fill in metadata and authorship and sourcing as they develop this particular content. And the standard would involve an immutable ledger of any modification that gets made to a particular piece of content. Now, this is an opt-in idea that would effectively require a change of how we approach information space online, because the idea is that any video, any piece of content that has that particular marker is now marked as safe or authenticated, or it can be traced to a source. And by contrast, those that do not will give a signal to the digital platforms and browsers that, hey, this piece of content may not be safe. We have no idea where it came from. It can be authenticated. It may be manipulated. And akin to the security measures that we've become accustomed to in the browser, will signal to the user that something is, and to the platforms that something is safe and authenticated and authentic versus not. But that, of course, is, you can imagine, is an internet standard that would require, that would work for any content going forward, not for any content that is already out there, and would require a change in thinking. But it is a promising effort, and it is an effort to increase transparency in our ecosystem that I think will be necessary, because you're right, the volume of and the scale of this content alone is bound to overwhelm any normal human senses, even those of us who can decipher this content. And it's also increasingly becoming more and more difficult to discern. So it will be important that there are automated systems in place that tell us that we can trust something versus not.
Yeah, I really like this idea, and I think it's really encouraging that the industry is starting to kind of come around some standards, because as you just suggested, I mean, it's not necessarily going to be completely, broadly applied initially, but even having this kind of digital watermarking would help, at least for the user. Again, going back to the previous question, it at least helps the user know who it is that's creating the content. So I think that's a really good aspect to this challenge. Now, moving away from the technical aspects for a second, what's the policymaker going to do here? So Mehmet asked this question: how do we regulate some of these AI applications? And are there suitable strategies or policies for governmental authorities in your view?
Yeah, it's a great question. Also a very difficult question. I know our conversation has focused on deepfakes in particular, but as hopefully you will walk away from this conversation seeing deepfakes is not the be all and end all of how AI can impact these campaigns. And so there are mitigations in place that we can start investing in now, including from policy perspective. For example, policymakers could really double down on trying to fund research into detection of synthetic content, or even means to identify that content. Or they can really go, throw their weight behind the provenance standards that the industry is trying to adapt. There is a need for a lot more transparency in this space. So one of the recommendations we made, for example, is to build this sort of a networked network defense approach to this problem, which means helping social media companies, incentivizing them and maybe requiring them to come together as an ecosystem to help stitch them together and identify and share information about the best practices, the best ways and technical ways to deal with some of these issues. And also bring AI developers into the fold at some point, because AI developers publishing technology, publishing their research openly are driving innovation in this space, but it is also something that can be misused because it is so open. So it's really important that either the community itself coalesces around norms for publication, or if it doesn't, there needs to be some incentive from the policymakers and lawmakers to be able to set some standards for how research is released and what does it mean to be releasing research responsibly. Other things are, smaller things like requiring that any chatbot interacting, any system, period, AI-enabled system interacting with a human needs to be labeled as an AI system interacting with a human. And that means placing burden on those that have to label it, and burden on those to come up with the solutions to be able to identify that this indeed is an AI system talking to a human. In most cases, it won't be a problem. If you want to buy airline tickets, you probably end up talking to a chatbot that will self-identify that it's a chatbot, that it's the other issues, that it's the other cases that we need to figure out how to protect against. And then in general, I think there's, we need to, as policymakers, we need to look at what are the impediments to social media companies and large and small to sharing information amongst themselves in order to be able to help this cross-platform problem. Because really, by the time Facebook sees a campaign, it's, any number of users has already seen it because it has launched somewhere else. And threat actors are taking notice and are increasingly going to smaller platforms that are maybe just starting up, maybe don't have the resource or the will to invest in security teams and sort of safety and integrity teams. They're exploiting those platforms and people who are on those platforms. So One of the things that policymakers can do is incentivize, or if that doesn't work, require that social media companies that engage, that allow this kind of engagement on their platforms, that they stand up threat modeling teams, that they stand up threat modeling processes and staff those teams in order to identify the scenarios of how they may be exploited and misused, and then publish takedown reports, publish the number of campaigns that have occurred on their platforms, because that helps our whole ecosystem understand how threat actors are misusing our information environments and where. And it also helps deter them, because there's more, we're shining the light into the dark places. And so the more we do that, the less incentive there is for threat actors to exploit that.
So let's focus a little bit more clearly on shining that light, okay, for just a second, because it ties neatly into a question from Elena, which is, how can corporations, and I would probably include social media companies, detect these narratives? So less about deepfakes, but the actual narratives, the misinformation and disinformation narratives before they rapidly spread. So is there a way to do that? And can that be kind of shared quickly across platforms in your view?
Narrative analysis is tough. I think, what are some of the technical means to detect a narrative? Well, you have to understand what you're looking for. There have to be some kind of indicators of what makes a narrative. And I know there are efforts underway in the US government to try and understand what that looks like. But those efforts are not going to be looking at the domestic environment on US social media. And I think it's important, that's why it's important for social media companies and smart people on their safety and integrity teams to get together and figure out what are those sort of the influence operations equivalent of indicators of compromise. What are those signs and indicators that they have now seen over the many campaigns on their platforms that are indicative? Signatures of particular threat actors, for example, signatures of coordination, perhaps the email addresses they tend to use, or the ISPs they tend to use, or other technical metadata that they may have access to. That ends up sort of almost fingerprinting particular actors, not narratives, because narratives are tough. Narratives can be, there isn't an easy way to detect a social media or an influence campaign based on just a narrative, because the conversation about a particular issue can be authentic and can be manipulated at the same time by foreign influence campaign that are amplifying that particular authentic conversation. And so it gets, when you look at content itself and the narratives itself, it gets really tough, which is why when you talk to social media companies and they tell you we look at coordination and inauthenticity as signatures, that's why they say that. They don't look at narratives for a reason. Because there are so many free speech issues involved in looking at narratives, and also very complicated to find. So I think I answered your question, but let me know if not.
I think you did, but I mean, clearly it's a tough problem, right? I mean, this is challenging for a host of both technical reasons and civil liberty reasons, et cetera, as you just demonstrated. I want to kind of combine a couple of questions that we're getting, and it gets back to this discussion about countermeasures. Robert asked about the status of R&D on countermeasures, and just in terms of how much is that happening. And then Adam wants to know, and I think a very related question is, can AI be part of the solution as it relates to countermeasures? So the kind of two pieces of this is, how much are we investing R&D, whether in the private sector or the government? And then the second piece is, kind of, is AI part of this solution, or is it just the problem?
No, as I mentioned, AI is definitely part of the solution. It is a general purpose / dual use technology. So it can be trained on patterns, for example. I'll give you an example of even the site this person does not exist. From that particular site chose to wrap a website around a very specific model that produces portraits that are all particularly symmetrical, that are positioned in the picture a particular way, and with a particular angle of the turn of the face. And so AI systems can, when they're trained on enough of that kind of data, they can be trained to identify that particular positioning. But platforms have to invest in that, or platforms that don't have a lot of resources have to go out and get that kind of know-how somewhere in order to implement it on their platforms. And there is, in terms of deepfakes, video and audio, there is a lot of investment. There's a DARPA project that has been working on trying to understand how to detect this kind of media, especially video and audio. But again, that's in progress. I hope soon this is going to be a robust and immovable object. The problem with GANs is that they're in a race between the technology that generates them and technology that detects them, and so we're always kind of catching up to the to what's next. And my understanding is that for now we are ahead, but we're waiting for the next iteration, I guess, to see how it's going to shift again, so we can catch our defenses up again.
Yeah, and this is the big challenge, right? Between kind of the offense defense piece in terms of the give and take, and that one side gets better and the other adjusts. Going back to the policy side, one individual, John, asked, do you think in the U.S. particular, so just in the United States, that new legislation is going to be necessary to actually address this challenge? Is this a legislative problem that's going to be required to really kind of move action on this challenge?
Well, there are a lot of different pieces in the challenge. I don't think we can have one big bill to say, we're going to address all disinformation, or one big bill that's going to address all AI-enabled disinformation. I think it has to be nuanced. For example, we need to identify what is the malicious behavior. Is the malicious behavior the impersonation that is involved, or is the malicious behavior the fact that foreign influence campaigns are happening on our platforms, or what is the desired behavior? And I think some of the legislation proposals have already tackled parts of the problem that even I presented today. There's a comprehensive privacy legislation that has been in the works for quite some time that would regulate, for example, what data and how much data we are able to pass around and share, and what is kept, and what are data brokers able to sell to different actors around the world. Parts of that are in progress. So there are pieces that we can legislate. We can require data brokers to be more transparent and regulate that industry about what kind of data they're selling to whom. On impersonation front, there's been some efforts at state level. It's difficult to predict whether this is possible at the national level. Parts of this can be potentially legislated, but we haven't yet exhausted the technical solutions either. So I think that there is more technology can do, and there's a lot more that industry can do and is doing. But it is a very difficult problem. And the difficulty of this problem is the demand side, how much we as human beings seek particular types of information. And, and who has the right to pass that information to us and who does not. The foreign influence bit has, we're starting to have a much better handle on. It's much more difficult to draw the line between what is disinformation and what isn't on the domestic front. And we don't have a consensus as a society on what that is. And before you can legislate it, you have to agree to it. And this is the conversation that needs to happen.
And the questions keep pouring in, which is fantastic. But one of the questions revolves around something that you mentioned earlier, which is Mohammed asked this question about collective defense models. You had mentioned this kind of concept of a collective defense model. How would that work in practice, and who would be the actors that you think are the kind of the essential actors as part of that collective defense model?
Well, when I say that, I think of several tiers of that, right? Government is obviously an actor, and US government and our allies and partners are all actors because they see different campaigns across their information environment, and their mission to counter foreign influence is the same, but they see different types of foreign influence, different types of campaign targeting their domestic environment that they can bring to bear and coalesce together to, again, identify what are sort of almost the fingerprints of the campaigns that are happening and how we can discover them faster and share information faster at the sort of like international level. On domestic level, it's harder because we have rules about to what extent US government can engage in our domestic information environment. This is where platforms need to cooperate. This is where platforms need to work together. And they're the best, potentially even the only line of defense there to be able to come together and tackle this issue. There's more clarity that we need to have around how platforms can work with the government and to what extent they can work with the government to share some of these indicators, not just from the government to the platforms, but the other way as well. So these are all questions that are for policymakers to tackle.
Yeah, we're coming up to the end of our hour, but if it's okay with you, Katya, I'd like to extend just for a few more minutes. But I'm going to ask you, we're going to go into the lightning round now, okay? So I'm going to ask you to kind of, I know, right? So I'm going to ask you questions and ask you for kind of maybe a 30-second to a minute kind of response on some of these, just so that we can hit a lot of the wonderful questions that have popped into here. One of those is, if you wanted to disrupt an adversary's disinformation campaign, which stage of the rich data framework would you prioritize as the place to disrupt that would be most effective?
I think we can start earlier than we usually start. We can start at building infrastructure stage. We can figure out where they're registering domains, where they're registering accounts, what email servers they use to register those as inauthentic accounts. And we can actually start much, much earlier. We can also do more in understanding what kind of reconnaissance capabilities they have and what are the sources of information they have. So right now, a lot of us, we don't hear much about campaigns until they're taken down and platforms discover an active campaign on their platform. But that kind of thing can move up into an earlier stages as well, I think.
Okay, great. So we focus predominantly on the role of kind of the adversary, right, in terms of what they do. How much of the effectiveness relies upon the user in terms of the user sharing and propagating that information further? in your
Yeah.
view?
A lot. And this is why we need like a massive public awareness campaign carefully without further endangering trust in information. But we need a massive campaign to educate the users how their emotional state gets manipulated in online environment and what happens next. The fact that we're resharing information because we are in heightened emotional state is often how threat actors get us to act. And this is really important. All of us need the tools to understand how we may be manipulated online, what our political biases are, and who may be trying to manipulate our political biases and get us to reshare this content.
Yeah, absolutely. Going back to deep fakes, we focus predominantly on trying to find them and those types of things. So let's say that we discover one. How much credit do you put into this kind of concept of the liar's dividend, right? So that we start to understand that they're all out there, and so now it's impossible to tell fact from fiction. And so, the bad operators can kind of get away with bad activity.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the biggest dangers. The danger is not even from the deepfake itself, but from the fact that the commodification of deepfake video can potentially endanger our trust in information, period. So I think of all the impacts of deepfakes, I worry about that one the most. And so this is where user education and awareness campaigns have to be carefully calibrating that and understanding, like, yes, people may actually start mistrusting information, but this is where the provenance standards on the other side will give us confidence in the authenticity of content. So this is a long-term goal. This isn't what we have in place today, but we've got to start working through that.
Yeah, I really like that option of kind of using digital provenance, not only for just the verification, but to undermine those pieces of that. I'd never really considered that. So that's wonderful. Let's go to incentives for a second. Incentives for the social media companies. How can we get them to share, or how could policymakers incentivize social media companies to either share information with independent researchers and those types of aspects, so that we can get a better understanding across the board of exactly what that threat model is that you've described so well?
Well, first, we need to understand what the impediments are. Social media companies are afraid of liability. They are afraid of being sued for violating someone's privacy. And because we don't have specific regulation around these issues, it is very difficult for them to navigate this space. So I think from the policymakers' perspective, we have to understand what are the impediments to sharing that information. Let's assume for a second that they actually want to collaborate with each other, because safety teams in many of these companies, they get up every day to try to make that platform safer and more appealing for their users. So let's assume for a second that they want to do that. Question is, what's standing in their way? And I don't think that we've invested enough into that particular question. Now, there's also the question of which researchers, and how do we ensure that the researchers are who they say they are? Not all are. So we need some vetting mechanisms around who is allowed to have access to user data that is private user data in order to conduct that kind of research. And this is where I think Congress has a role to play to convene and really get into the weeds of the problem and understand how the whole ecosystem can move forward.
Yeah, without a doubt. An interesting kind of thought came into the chat, which was this kind of concept of, some platforms don't allow resharing, right? You kind of get what you're going to get, but you can't reshare it. we'll put aside the challenges of saying, no, you can't reshare, because I think there's some free speech types of issues associated with that. Do you think that would discernibly make a difference in these campaigns if there was some way to limit that aspect? Or what are your thoughts on kind of apps that don't allow resharing right now?
I don't know empirically, but it is a proposition that's worth testing. I think for a time, Twitter, for example, implemented this policy of, and Facebook too, implemented this policy of asking the user, are you sure you want to reshare this? Or have you read this article? And it actually, don't you want to read this article before you share it or retweet it? And that actually stopped a lot of resharing. So there is some evidence to suggest that introducing nudges into this sort of like almost automatic behavior of reacting to content, introducing some of these nudges and some of the sort of some noise in the system actually can clamp down on some of the amplification efforts. So it's worth testing some of these ideas and see how they work.
Yeah, this isn't necessarily an idea, but it's a challenge that just that showed up as well in the questions, which is with the demise of third-party cookies, and I have not looked at this. I hope you have. With the demise of third-party cookies, what does that mean for kind of contextualized advertising? And would that fundamentally alter kind of the propagation of these campaigns, in your view?
Oof, this is a bit out of like way ahead of my skis there. I have not looked at the impact of cookies on advertising ecosystem in a little bit of time. My cookie time was, probably about 10 years ago, where I was having to implement those things and support them. But I'm glad we're having this conversation. I hope that maybe whoever is asking has an answer of what impact might be.
Yeah, well, we may have to follow up on that one later. Just two last ones as we seek to wrap up this discussion. And I apologize in advance that we're not going to be able to get to everyone's questions. The next question is the effectiveness of what the term that was used by Rafe is an element of lexical analysis to take into account things like sarcasm and those types of pieces. I could see this showing up in a couple of different ways, like with large language models being more authentic, et cetera. So what is your thoughts along this aspect of it?
Well, I think it's an interesting field. There's so much interesting stuff and relevant stuff going on in AI right now, understanding lexical analysis, understanding psychographics. I mean, it can be a curse or it can be a blessing as well. I will say that one of the demos for GPT-3 was a sarcastic chatbot. So we know that, and this isn't even like an open domain chatbot. It was a chatbot built on GPT-3 as a demo. So we know that the technology is moving in that direction, understanding nuance, understanding sarcasm. And what scares me about that scenario is that, well, okay, if we can have a sarcastic chatbot, then maybe we can have a misdirecting, trolling chatbot, or maybe we can have an antagonizing chatbot. So it seems like, to me, this is where it could move if a threat actor really wants to exploit that. I think there's a lot of interesting stuff going on in natural language processing, and it's an area that is rich and is being tapped for solutions. So I just want to make sure that we know that AI is not just going to enable the bad guys. It is enabling solutions as well. It's just not something we tackled in this particular paper.
Understand. I want to just kind of, as we wrap things up, I want to pull out to some of the really high level questions. And the penultimate question is this thought process about how are we going to sell any solution? Al asked this question: how are you going to sell a solution to the American public without it looking like censorship?
Well, that's a tough one. I think it's important to tell the American public that there's a difference between a fact, an opinion, commentary, and really sort of start discerning how those kinds of that kind of speech is different. And it's not for us to necessarily censor that speech, is to give them the tools to understand what is provable reality and what is someone's interpretation of that provable reality. I think that has to be part of the conversation in digital and media literacy, because without that, where we may move into the world, especially with increased volume that AI brings, where our information reality perception is so narrow and so segmented that there is no basis for consensus. And that is even more dangerous than what some would say is censorship.
Yeah, and the last question kind of has this context about how various countries are approaching this, and specifically Russia and China. The characterization that Ryan offers is that it seems that China seems to promote kind of soft power and kind of reiterating memes and trollings for kind of mass effect, while the Russian tactics seem to be a little bit more focused on soft power, maybe potentially a little more targeted. Do you find that viewpoint congenial? Do you think that how would you characterize, we'll just ask it this way, how do you characterize the differences right now, knowing that this is likely to shift over time between China and Russia as it relates to disinformation?
I think it's important to understand that in both cases, campaigns and approaches support strategic interests of those nations. The fact that Russian actors have sort of been known to be more disruptive, to sort of provide many different narratives and sort of muddying the environment. We know that from our experience, but they've also driven particular specific narratives that they wanted to drive. China's approach it seems to have been more focused on promoting a positive vision of China, of the sort of the advantages of their approach to organizing their society versus what democracies can do, especially in the context of, say, dealing with COVID. But they're also using inauthentic means to do that. They're using bots to do that. And the wolf warrior diplomacy and the kind of communication that has been coming out of the China's diplomatic accounts more and more has also shown that they aren't above pushing conspiracy theories and laundering them from some obscure, authentic source in the United States and laundering them into the mainstream and reiterating them, even though they are completely baseless in fact. So it's difficult to say how they will converge or not converge. I think the toolkits are in many ways defined by the information environment that they are targeting. And those things, the targets are similar. What they choose to pull on when depends on their strategic objectives at the time.
Wonderful. And Katya, I just want to thank you again for just a wonderful webinar. But more than that, just as we consider the challenges of disinformation, to me, you and your researchers have actually helped that first step in terms of helping us better understand the scope of the problem and some early kind of recommendations on how to go forward. I want to turn it back over to Lynn for any last words. Thank you again, Katya.
Many thanks to you, John, for being such a capable moderator, and to Katya, congratulations on an engaging, fascinating conversation with a lot of audience participation, and we will keep in mind your opening words from the beginning of the program. And thanks too to everyone else who's joined us today and for your comments and questions. We're sorry we couldn't get to them all. There were some really good ones. If you'd like to learn more about CSET, please go to our website, cset.georgetown.edu, and sign up for our newsletter and research updates. Our next webinar will take place on March 10th. It will feature CSET's Will Hunt discussing overseas production of high-end semiconductors that are key to AI, advanced computing, and other specialized tasks. It's called Bringing the Chipmakers Home, Attracting Manufacturers and Talent to Sustain Them. And it will be moderated by John Verwey. In the meantime, please stay safe, and we hope to see you again, if only virtually, real soon.